In 2015, Coca-Cola released an advertisement celebrating Fanta's 75th anniversary. 75 years earlier was 1940, Nazi Germany. But the controversy left behind a much more interesting question. Why did Coca-Cola need to invent Fanta in Germany in the first place? Behind Fanta was a German Coca-Cola executive named Max Kaif. The war cut off supplies, but Kaif kept finding ways to keep Coca-Cola alive. The further Kaif went to keep Coca-Cola alive, the harder it became to tell where survival ended and complicity began. This is relish history. Back in the 1920s, Coca-Cola was already one of America's most popular soft drinks. But Europe was different. The French had wine, the British had tea, and Germans had beer. Cola was still unfamiliar to most Europeans. Germany was an especially difficult market. Non-alcoholic soft drinks were often seen as syrup drinks for children rather than something grown men would drink. Many Germans also believed that cold drinks, with the strange exception of beer, could cause stomach aches. In April 1929, an American named Ray Powers opened Germany's first Coca-Cola bottling plant in Essen. Powers was relentlessly optimistic and an excellent salesman, but by the end of his first year, he had burned through almost all of his money and sold just 5,840 cases of Coca-Cola. The problem was that many Germans still didn't really know what Coca-Cola was, or even how it was supposed to be served. Even when Germans tried Coke, they often drank it warm. So Powers' salesman carried bottles and ice in a heavy tin-lined briefcase called the Zilfertasche, the case of size. It let customers take Coke properly chilled. They also printed millions of leaflets called Was ist Coca-Cola? What is Coca-Cola? Salesmen left them on restaurant tables again and again until the name became familiar. Slowly, it began to work. By 1933, Coca-Cola Germany, officially Coca-Cola GmbH, was selling more than 100,000 cases a year. And that was the year Max Kaif arrived. If Powers knew how to win people over, Kaif knew how to make people fall in line. When Kaif opened Powers' desk and found unpaid bills, unopened bank statements, and chaotic finances, he quickly put the company back in order. He tolerated little public disagreement, and his employees were afraid of him. But many were fiercely loyal. Kaif demanded brutal hours from them and from himself, often working 12-hour days and sometimes well past midnight. One aide later summed him up perfectly. For Kaif, it wasn't Germany above all. It was Coca-Cola über alles. Coca-Cola above all. Kaif became managing director in 1937. When Powers died after a car accident the following year, Kaif was left the undisputed leader of Coca-Cola Germany. But his next problem couldn't be solved with better bookkeeping or harder salesmanship. Coca-Cola had an identity problem. As Nazi Germany became increasingly nationalist and xenophobic, Coca-Cola's American origins became a liability. Its biggest German rival, Africola, went in the opposite direction, proudly emphasizing its German identity. Then, in 1936, Africola owner Karl Flach toured the Coca-Cola bottling plant in New York and noticed bottle caps printed in Hebrew. The caps were completely ordinary. They simply marked Coca-Cola as kosher for Jewish consumers. But Flach saw a weapon. He brought them back to Germany and used them in propaganda, claiming Coca-Cola was an American Jewish company. The accusation was absurd, but in Nazi Germany, it was dangerous. Being American was a liability. Being branded as Jewish was something much worse. Kaif set out to change that. At the 1936 Berlin Olympics, Kaif supplied large quantities of Coke to athletes and visitors. By then, German sales had passed 1 million cases a year. A year later, Coca-Cola was operating a working bottling display at the Nazi regime's Schaffen des Volk exhibition. Coca-Cola was no longer just selling to Germans. It was learning to present itself as part of a Germany the regime wanted to showcase. And by 1938, the image was much harder to ignore. At Coca-Cola Germany's annual convention, around 105,000 people gathered beneath a huge Coca-Cola banner. Directly below it hung 3 enormous swastikas. The meeting ended with a ceremonial pledge to Coca-Cola, followed by 3 cries of Sieg Heil to Hitler. By 1939, Coca-Cola no longer seemed quite so foreign in Germany, but the system it had adapted to was about to create a far bigger problem. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland and Europe went to war. The war was closing Germany off from America. Coca-Cola GmbH could make most of what it needed locally. But one crucial ingredient still had to come from abroad, 7X, the secret concentrate that gave Coca-Cola its flavor. Keith feared that sooner or later the 7X would run out. Coca-Cola tried several routes to keep the concentrate coming into Germany, but none offered a reliable solution. In December 1939, he told his chemists to make something else. It couldn't simply be another Coca-Cola. It had to be fruity, aromatic, and made from ingredients they could still get inside Germany. What they came up with looked nothing like the orange Fanta sold today. They used apple pressings from cider production, whey from making cheese, and artificial sweetener. Keith later described it as leftovers from leftovers. Then they needed a name. Keith told his employees to use their fantasy, their imagination. Joe Knibb, the salesman from earlier, immediately came up with Fanta. Just as Keith had feared, the United States entered the war in late 1941. New Coca-Cola supplies stopped completely. Germany still had some Coke in storage, but by the end of 1942, even that was gone. By then, Fanta was no longer just a substitute. It had become Coca-Cola Germany's main product. By 1943, it was selling nearly 3 million cases a year, not far from Coca-Cola's pre-war peak of about 4.5 million. Fanta's success had a lot to do with wartime scarcity. Sugar was heavily rationed, and some Germans weren't even drinking Fanta. They used it to sweeten soups and stews. But Fanta was doing something even more important for Keith. Nazi rules restricted companies from advertising products that were no longer available. Once Coca-Cola supplies ran out, Keith could no longer keep the brand visible by selling and promoting Coke itself. Fanta gave Coca-Cola GmbH something to keep selling, and a reason to keep existing. Its advertisement still carried the words, "A product of Coca-Cola GmbH." It was keeping Coca-Cola alive without Coca-Cola. But there was still another threat. Coca-Cola GmbH was still foreign-owned, which meant the Nazi government could seize it as enemy property. Keith's solution was to get inside the system that threatened him. With lawyer Walter Oppenhoff, he secured positions in the enemy property bureaucracy and gained influence over Coca-Cola operations across German-controlled Europe. Keith used that position to keep Coca-Cola operations alive in occupied countries and to spread Fanta while Coke syrup was disappearing. During the war, all 43 Coca-Cola plants in Germany were hit at some point. Essen was hit especially hard. Keith responded by setting up what he called siding plants. Bottling equipment was moved outside the cities into old farmhouses and dairies. When the main plants were damaged, Fanta could still be produced while they were being repaired. In For God, Country and Coca-Cola, author Mark Pendergrast summed Keith up simply. He was willing to do almost anything to keep the Coca-Cola business going. In January 1945, with Germany already collapsing, Keith was summoned by a senior official in the Ministry of Commerce. He was ordered to nationalize Coca-Cola Germany and drop the Coca-Cola name. He was given 2 days to comply, or face being sent to a concentration camp. Keith refused. Keith went with Oppenhoff to the Ministry of Justice for help, but left empty-handed. No one was willing to risk intervening. The confrontation was supposed to continue the next day. It never did. The official who had issued the order was killed in an Allied air raid. Against the odds, Coca-Cola Germany had survived the war with its name intact. When American Coca-Cola men finally found Keith, he was still bottling Fanta in a half-destroyed plant. After everything Keith had survived, the end of the war should have been a relief. It wasn't. Keith later said the years after the war were even worse breakdown for him than the Nazi period. Back in Atlanta, Keith was praised as a hero. But in Germany, one American observer called him a second Hitler. The technical observers overseeing Coca-Cola operations in occupied Germany saw Keith very differently. They initially refused to give him Coca-Cola syrup and restricted his Fanta production. At the same time, post-war Germany was in ruins. Sugar and fruit were hard to find, and many Germans could barely afford soft drinks at all. Fanta sales collapsed from more than 2 million cases in 1944 to around 500,000 in 1945. But Keith waited. In 1949, he got hold of a shipment of old Coca-Cola syrup, had it reworked, and quietly started bottling Coke again. Soon, trucks were leaving the plant under signs announcing, "Coca-Cola ist wieder da." Coca-Cola is back. As the American Technical Observer system wound down, Keith regained control of Coca-Cola Germany. And in the years that followed, his position inside Coca-Cola only grew stronger. He became one of the company's most powerful figures in Europe and was later sent to help launch Fanta across Africa and the Middle East. Inside Coca-Cola, the man who had kept the German business alive through the war had become something of a legend. Outside the company, his legacy was much harder to define. He wasn't simply a businessman standing outside the Nazi system. He had learned how to work inside it when Coca-Cola needed him to. As more of his employees were drafted, Keith turned to ex-convicts, Chinese workers, and laborers from elsewhere in Europe. But that loyalty could cut both ways. He even hired Hermann Natz, a former concentration camp prisoner jailed for his communist background. Keith's attitude was simple. You are a Coca-Cola man, not a communist. Keith's record is difficult to fit neatly into the role of either hero or collaborator. And that may be the most unsettling thing about Keith. The qualities that made him so effective were also the qualities that made him so difficult to judge. What Coca-Cola saw as extraordinary loyalty could, from the outside, look like moral tunnel vision. For Keith, Coca-Cola was no longer simply a job. It had become something closer to a secular calling. The question was no longer whether Coca-Cola should survive. Keith had already answered that. The question was how far he was willing to go to keep it alive. And by then, the answer had seemed to be almost anything. For Max Keith, it really was Coca-Cola über alles. Coca-Cola above all. And Fanta survived the war too. The wartime drink gradually disappeared after the war. But in 1955, Coca-Cola brought the name back in Italy, this time for an orange-flavored soda, the beginning of the Fanta most people recognize today. The recipe was new. The name wasn't. Mark Pendergrast later said he didn't think anyone at Coca-Cola cared much that the name had its roots in Nazi Germany. They probably thought no one would pay attention. For a long time, they may have been right. Then came 2015. The 75th anniversary ad talked about bringing back the good old times. And suddenly, the history behind the name was impossible to ignore. Eventually, people did.